So, Joe, you have brought to the table a very interesting piece of the puzzle. And as you know, I am the puzzle putter together. So I am curious, I'm going to pick your brains about this aspect. I've managed to work out quite a lot of the creation of Christianity, the origins of it, why it was created, how they did it, where they did it, when they did it, obviously, timeline, and bringing in the pagan parallels is one of my specialties. But I had been curious about the Judaic aspects, in particular Judea, the locations, not the scriptures necessarily, because I've also, easily discovered where various Jewish ideas have come in. I made charts with scriptures from what is called the Old Testament and how they were used as a blueprint for the creation of the messianic prophecies. In other words, so these messianic scriptures, all that stuff. But I always was curious about, why Galilee? Why does Jesus start here? Why does he go there? Why Chorazin? And why many of the not the mythical factors of the story, but the stuff that's anchoring it into history and Judea. And it looks like to me that you figured that out in a big way, and that's even down to the minutiae of various characters, like, why are they named Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, or not Luke necessarily, because he was never a disciple, but the disciples' names, and Simon, why is this name used, and, what is that all about? Because in this formulation of the gospel story, like I said, I can bring in all these pagan parallels, and I can figure out the virgin birth, the resurrection, the ascension, where they get this stuff from. But I can even figure out why Pilate and Herod, because Pilate was really detested, so make him the villain makes perfect sense. There must have been a memory. By the time the Gospels were written, there must have been a memory of Pilate having committed crimes for the Samaritans, for example, the massacre and so forth. But these very specific parts of the story that we have Jesus traveling here and getting involved with this person and back and forth, it seems like you've figured that out, and I'm happy to put that piece of the puzzle in there. So I would like to hear. I'm really interested in your Josephus work, where you've actually come up with the idea that at a certain point it was clear that the Romans were trying to get the Jews to bow down before Caesar. So that's another interesting. We see this authoritarian attempt in the New Testament quite handily. Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. Obey authorities, for they are instituted by God. Slaves, obey your masters. All that stuff. I mean, that's really clear as a bell that there's an agenda here. But I think you've pegged the particular group of people who were really interested in bowing the rebellious Jewish factions down. And in fact, it makes a lot of sense that we see the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. So I'm really interested in the parallels that you've come up with that tell us why Chorazin, why Judea, Galilee, why that drama there. So could you kind of give me the most obvious stuff that you can think of that
Sure.
You've come up with in that
Sure.
regard?
Before I do that, though, I just want to point something out that I'm often asked, what scholarship was I involved with when I started to uncover the typology between Jesus and Titus? And I always say that there was only two people that were actually influencing me, and they were Robert Eisenman and Acharya, that I had actually, in my opinion, I had gotten to a sort of an open mind as far as, well, what is this story about? And that, as I mentioned to people, they were like to me, they were planks that sort of enabled me just to be able to see a different perspective to the Gospels. And so I just wanted to thank you for that.
Thank you.
And the overall structure of details in the adult ministry of Jesus are dependent on the military campaign of Titus Flavius. And the sort of an overview is first of all, just the actual physical journey. Jesus starts his ministry, his adult ministry in Galilee. He talks constantly about the destruction of cities that will occur, cities that like Chorazin. He then takes a journey from there to Jerusalem. When he gets to Jerusalem, he spends some time outside and has all these little skirmishes with Jews. There's a lot of martial imagery that the gospel authors use, waiting for Jesus to actually have his triumphal entry. He then has the entry, falls on bad times, has the Last Supper, and then the trial, but is from that point taken outside of Jerusalem. And you have the crucifixion, and then he ends up actually in John 21 back at the Sea of Galilee. And so one of the things that I noticed was just the journey itself was the same one that Titus took.
Okay, so Titus, now you got this information. Titus, you obviously we explained, was the emperor at the end of from 70 to 79.
79 through 81.
79 through 81 CE, and prior to that was his father Vespasian. Yes. And they were responsible essentially for the destruction of the Jewish temple during that period.
That's correct,
in
They
70.
They had been sent by Nero to essentially crush a rebellion that was messianic. Josephus recorded that what most propelled the Jews to rebel was their belief that a world ruler would come from Judea. And so in the middle of the war, the Flavian family, with help from the Herods and the Alexanders, seized the throne. Mm-hmm. And Vespasian returned to Rome, but he left Titus and Tiberius Alexander to oversee the siege, crush the rebellion, and then raise the temple. So,
and this history is mainly contained in the writings of Josephus.
Right.
And you were reading Josephus.
Right. Well,
vis-a-vis the Gospels,
yeah.
And you said, "Holy moly!"
Well, my two favorite authors quoted Josephus quite a lot, and I got a copy of the book because I wanted just to have come to my understanding of this from a deeper place, and I like to work with the source material, and so I got a copy of Josephus, and I started to read it, and a couple passages troubled me very much. I just couldn't quite. They didn't fit right in my head. And one of them was Titus's first big battle in Galilee. And at the battle, he orders his troops to go after a group of rebellious Jews who are in boats on the Sea of Galilee. They sink the boats, and then the Romans catch the Jews like fish with their spears. And so that just didn't sit right with me. I go, well, wait a second, that's unusual. And then the other one was the famous Cannibal Mary, where it just struck me that this child was clearly a human Passover lamb.
Okay, so there's a story in Josephus about a woman named Mary who eats her son.
That's correct, yeah.
And it's a ritual sacrifice, you
Well,
feel.
it's a Passover lamb. She says that, or Josephus records that she is from the house of hyssop. And she roasts the child before she eats it, and then she calls him my sacrifice. And then in a few paragraphs later, Josephus records that the reason why Jerusalem was so swollen with individuals is because they had come to celebrate the Passover.
Yeah, so weird, huh?
And in the
a son of Mary who's eaten at the Passover.
Well, that's exactly, and that was
the Lamb of God.
The Lamb of God that's eaten, and in the Gospels they combine hyssop, where Jesus is touched with hyssop on the cross, with the fact that they don't break his legs, because that's one of there's 3 instructions that God gives for the preparation of the Passover lamb. And in Josephus,
So he's the Passover lamb.
yeah, in Josephus, they say he is from the house of hyssop. The child is from the house of hyssop, and he is roasted. And that's one of the other instructions. You have to roast the Passover lamb. So so Josephus used the same technique that the author in John used, where they combine hyssop with one of the instructions of how to prepare the Passover lamb to set up the
recipe
metaphor.
for the...
Yeah. But you see, this just troubled me. I wanted then to try to figure out why these seemingly weird sort of parallels existed. That's what set me up. Yeah.
Yeah, the military campaign takes some strange. It takes a particular direction. Obviously, this is something that happened in history.
Yes.
And so this explains, from a mythicist perspective, why it was, like, say, if you take all of these myths of, as in my work, we have stories that were attached to myths of other gods, like Krishna, Buddha, Osiris, Horus, and so forth. And you start to, and you can make a story out of all of this. You can make this archetypal, mythical figure and a nice tale about that. But then to anchor it into history, it was perplexing to me to say, why did they, like I say, why did they do that, and so forth and so on. And so, but now it struck you that the reason they anchored it into history the way they did was to emulate the campaign of Titus in Judea.
That's right. Yeah, and again, it's I don't mean to become a admiration society, but if you just take your work and put it in the mind of someone, and then have them read the Gospels and Josephus carefully, basically they can then just start to fill in the details. Once they have a broad form of the symbols that are being used, the ones that fall out then are just left over, and you can actually just start piecing them into Josephus. And so the typology, which was what people call this, the relationship between Jesus and Titus, was just an extension of a system of typology that they have in the very first page of Matthew. And in Matthew, you have this bizarre story of Jesus' childhood where Joseph goes to Egypt. Why does he do that? It's because they're doing a linkage in the form of midrash technique in Hebraic literature, where they just take enough elements from one story and put them in another to show that there's a divine pattern or connection. And so then you go forward, as you go forward in the childhood of Jesus, then you end up with all these events, and you end up at not 40 years, but 40 days. It's close enough for typologic work, and it may not be the wilderness that Moses ran around in, right, so but it's a wilderness. So
now you're making a connection of a mythical motif, or a motif from the story of Moses, who actually I do perceive as a myth. Yeah. And we know, if you look at the stories of Elijah and Joseph and other Old Testament figures, Joshua is a big one, that it's clear that elements of the Christ story were taken from those characters as well. I mean, we're talking a big mishmash. And then I've worked out a lot of those details, and so have other people, obviously. But yeah, the historical relationships that we find in there with the people who clearly were part of history, and they're not just mythical figures like Pilate. Pilate is actually a little bit too early for the period that we're talking about. So it's anachronistic. But Herod, which Herod is at that point? There's Herod Agrippa, there's Herod the Great, Agrippa II.
Let me just explain Pilate, and then we can work back to the Herod. In Josephus, there's an event where Joseph Bar Matthias, which is the real name of Josephus, begs the Roman commander, who is Titus, to take someone down from the cross. And there's a group of 3 people being crucified. And in the story, Joseph Bar Matthias then gets the people down from the cross, and one miraculously survives.
And that's in Josephus.
That's in Josephus, and that occurs directly after the human Passover lamb. It's the next this event, and so then working back 40 years, the Roman commander of the story that they are creating with their fictional Jesus character, the Roman commander at that time was Pontius Pilate, and so and then the character
Okay.
Joseph Arimathea is
Joseph Bar
a takeoff of Joseph Bar Matthias, and he begs Pontius Pilate to bring him down from the cross.
Okay,
and
so now we have Josephus parallel of a different era.
Yeah.
So Pilate, so now we know we've got, this is in Josephus, and it's like
Yes.
staring boldly at us.
Yes.
You know, we're looking at it idiotically, apparently, because no one else has noticed these
Right.
things. So that part of it is explained, but then there's a different era that is applicable to different aspects of Christ's life, and that would be this whole time of Titus and his military campaign. And can you give us some really neat parallels between the life of Titus and
Sure, I'll
how
just
it
give
was reworked
Yeah.
in?
Yeah, some of
in
them
the
are
New
very
Testament?
complicated, and the thing to remember is that, you know, when you go through the gospel and you lay the ministry of Jesus on top of Titus's military campaign, that you'll come up with very exotic parallels, which need a lot of explanation. But there are some which are just absolutely transparent because they're the same thing. I mean, first of all, you have the geographical trip, the locations.
Yeah, that I'm really interested in. That.
And then you also have things like encircling Jerusalem with a wall.
Yeah, that, of
Jesus
course, yeah.
makes the prophecy at the same point in the dual storyline that Titus actually does encircle Jerusalem with a wall. Jesus predicts the abomination of desolation will occur. This is a really specific event that's only mentioned 3 or 4 times in all of literature. And if you're following along in the dual storyline, there's the abomination of desolation in Titus's military campaign.
And that's in Josephus.
It's in Josephus. And it is specifically stated to be the abomination of desolation that was predicted by Daniel. They actually use the prophet and the description of the abomination, and it is in exactly the right place. So the first thing that I think someone can notice is that the journey is the same. Titus comes to Jerusalem, but like Jesus, he spends a lot of time doing things before he goes inside, before he has his triumphal entrance. So, and then he after the event where the temple is raised, then he leaves, and then you have events outside of Jerusalem. So you have this very precise geography parallel. Then you have events and items which are the same thing: the abomination of desolation, the encircling Jerusalem with a wall, the fact that when Titus says that now it's time to go on to Jerusalem, he sends messengers ahead in the same way that Jesus does when he says that now I'm turning my face to Jerusalem, I'm going on. So you have parallels which are not really open for debate because they're not parallel, they're essentially the same thing. Then you have a level of parallels which are, from the linguistic purpose, just too obvious to be negated or to be gainsaid.
Denied, yeah.
And I'll give you an example. Jesus says, I come to divide a family 3 for 2, and he repeats the concept. And if you're following along in Josephus's version, he says at that point that the family inside the city began to have divisions and were divided 3 for 2.
Huh,
and so that's, again, these are really unusual sorts of parallels.
Specific.
Yeah. And they don't necessarily pop out or have great meaning, but it's only when you put them in the context of this overall stream of events. So you have a lot of parallels that are just completely transparent. The woe saying Jesus goes on for a whole series of woes, Jerusalem, woe is this,
Right.
woe is that. And
So were these places actually destroyed by Titus during
Yes.
Titus's campaign?
Yes, that's right.
So
Yeah.
that explains why Chorazin.
Of course, yeah.
Chorazin.
Well, the Galilean towns that were crushed and destroyed were, that Jesus predicted, were simply just the ones that Titus destroyed.
And we should say that the prediction is actually hindsight. Where
Right.
they're
I mean, you can't see into the
taking it out of
future, so we know that
history,
the
yeah.
author's already got this stuff. So
Right.
the fact is, it's pretty clear, right, that the thought world of the author, as he goes through
Yeah.
these events, is got to be somewhat related to the Flavian court, because in that court,
The Flavians being Titus,
Vespasian, and Domitian, yeah. The reason why is just that, as I see it, the Caesars were pretty vain, and their military achievements were well known. And if you wanted to please Caesar, I think you would know about what he had achieved. So,
and these particular people
Yeah.
were profoundly influential in ways that others were not
Yeah.
during that era. I mean, the destruction of the Jerusalem temple itself and the removal of the treasure
Yeah.
and the scriptures,
Yeah.
which, I mean, this is something that was highly valued by some very powerful and influential people in that
Yes.
area. And in fact, the people who were working with Titus and Vespasian, at least this family, this Alexanders, these were Jewish people, and they were extremely wealthy and obviously very influential.
right.
And so this is not some, mere footnote here.
Right. In
This
fact,
is like a huge...
reading your work really helps someone understand the context of where the money and the power that Christianity is somehow popping up. The court of Antonia was really where a lot of this power had all these intersections. Cnaeus was Antonia was the mother of Nero, and she had a vast...
Nero was the emperor
Nero
who
was the emperor
appointed
at the time, yes.
Vespasian and eventually led to the destruction of
Yeah,
Jerusalem.
that's right. So his court contained as a personal secretary to Antonia the supposedly most intelligent individual in the empire, who was this secretary named Cnaeus, who was also a beautiful woman and was the mistress of Vespasian.
Okay.
Now, her money was being handled by the Albarch of Alexandria, who was the brother of the philosopher Philo and the father of Tiberius Alexander.
Yeah, it's very
Right, it's getting
familial
incestuous.
here.
Now,
yeah.
he had two sons. He had a son named Marcus. Marcus married another inhabitant of the court, Bernice,
Bernice was a Herodian.
who was the daughter of one of the Herods. So then when Marcus died, Bernice took up famously as the concubine or mistress of Titus. So the three families are sitting there. You have the Alexanders,
Really?
the Herods, and the Flavians. They are sleeping with each other,
Amazingly powerful.
and they have total control.
They're in charge of Rome, Alexandria, and Jerusalem.
Exactly.
And these are the three of the most important
Well,
players
yeah,
in the Christ myth.
That's correct.
Creation.
Yeah.
And then the other one is Syria, and there was a Syrian connection too with somebody. The ruler of Syria was also involved with this.
That's right. Yeah.
So you're talking majorly powerful, incredibly wealthy group of people who could quite handily influence history in any direction they wanted, really. And anybody who steps in their way, they just slaughter. And in fact, they destroy an entire city in order to just remove a power base to transpose that power somewhere else. And also, I think that destruction was a clearing of a way to get people, if they were going to anchor this mythical, archetypal, human sacrifice, Son of God mythos into history, where better to put it than someplace that has been destroyed and there's like no evidence left.
Exactly.
People haven't lived there in decades.
Yeah.
Nobody can attest that it didn't happen.
Right. Yeah.
You see?
And
So
exactly.
it was perfect. It was almost like
it was a perfect crime where they evaporated all the evidence, and that, in my opinion, that's why they had never found a single scrap of Hebraic literature from the era, not one, until the scrolls are found buried in caves. I think what they did was they just scrubbed it. They just got rid of it because they didn't want it competing, and they didn't want the real history to be known.
That sounds totally
They
plausible.
couldn't pull off this caper if there were documents that were actually in the era talking about what the Christ was really like. So,
well, as an ideation, not as a real person.
exactly,
who
not
had
as a
existed.
real person.
The scrolls, as a matter of fact, there's the research by Dr. Norman Golb, who says the scrolls were not products of this esoteric group of the Essenes who were hiding
Right.
out at Qumran, but had been deposited there from the Jerusalem area. They were private libraries, or possibly even the temple library that they had secreted at Qumran, but not an internal creation from sectarians who were living there, and that would have happened around 70 CE.
Exactly.
So that is a fascinating thing, and we know from the scrolls too that there are many ideas in the scrolls that found their way into Christianity.
In a perverse form, they did, yes.
Yes, and that would make sense that in Jerusalem there was that part of this amalgamation going on that was eventually going to become Christianity, and then during this destruction and seizure, we have the Jewish scriptures, possibly the first time the Hebrew scriptures have ever been touched by non-Jews.
Yeah.
They're taken away. Now, there was the Septuagint, and it's hard to say. I mean, that couldn't have been all that secretive, because the Egyptian Greco-Egyptian rulers had commissioned it. So somebody may have had their hands on, some non-Jews may have had their hands on the Old Testament, what is called the Tanakh, before that period. But there, as far as I know, there was a thrust that they really wanted to get their hands on the Hebrew texts,
Right.
and possibly other intertestamental literature that was egging on the terrorists, the Jewish terrorists,
Yes.
who were, they would be considered to be rabid nationalists and so forth. But the barbarism of these particular groups, factions we're talking about, was almost like the Taliban. It wasn't just, oh, we don't like your cult, so we're going to destroy you. These guys were like vicious and
They were just the most fanatical zealots imaginable.
constant raids and attacks
Yeah.
and killing people and taking hostages and all manner of things. Right.
Right. And a really good sort of conceptualization of that occurs in one of your books, where you talk about the secret brotherhood aspect of Masonry, and how you can see symbols in the Dead Sea Scrolls that end up later on in Freemasonry. And you can also see some of these concepts in the Gospels. For example, as you point out, Jesus is referred to, they translate it often as carpenter, but it can also be essentially stonemason.
The tecton.
Tecton. And that word is the word that in Greece, the modern secret brotherhood of the Freemason is actually known by.
Yeah, I love that.
Right. I mean, it's amazing.
That comes from me knowing modern Greek. If I didn't know modern Greek, I would never know that.
But that insight
tecton means Freemason in modern Greek.
And that's such an amazing insight, because you see what that does is show that the Romans, when they took the law, which was their term for this Jewish scripture, and they brought it back, and Josephus records that they took it into the imperial court and they kept it there. They wouldn't let anyone else see it. All of the other artifacts they brought back from the war, they had on display. But the scriptures they kept to themselves. And what must have happened is they decoded them and got into this deeper level of the secret brotherhood. And that is, I think, was the basis for this Jesus-Titus typology. That kind of very esoteric expression of ideas and of pointing in the direction of who is divine, that was where it came from. And again, the best way to start sort of understanding and getting your head around that is your description of the secret brotherhoods.
Which much more widespread than people
exactly.
understand.
Yeah.
We have this impression that Judea was this wasteland of shepherds and nothingness going on, and that Jesus descended upon, and then in other directions there was nothing but barbarism. You'd have to remove all of ancient Greece and the high culture that they had attained, and Rome and everything. To pull this off, it would have to be really this just no culture going on.
Yeah,
You know, it's so ludicrous.
Exactly,
actually.
and that
It's a totally erroneous depiction. When in fact, all around the Mediterranean was a network of, you know, it would be multiple. They were loosely connected, of brotherhoods that had. They're well established. There's actually industry going on. There's not just, you know, some shepherds. Yeah. They had a variety of industries. And one of the most obvious of these brotherhood networks that that had to do with real life. That wasn't just like we're going to go and put funny hats on, you know, on Saturday night or something, and down at the Shriners Club or something. You know, that was the cult of Mithraism, was not just some goofy ritualistic thing, but it had to do with undertaking, it had to do with burial. This was the burial guild. You know, if you were involved in undertaking and mortuary work, and heck, if you were in Egypt, that was like the whole, you know, mortuary literature. The whole culture was designed. Religion and burial. It was incredibly important. Then, at the certain era, you were probably going to be initiated into Mithraism. And so now we find that that's the case with the Carpenter Guild. And we find that, and unquestionably, the Masons had this kind of guild going on,
and
too.
And people don't understand the power of that fact, the way that you bring the secret brotherhood out. Because, I mean, here's how it influenced me, is that when I come to those events then in the Gospels, having read your work and having read Eisenman and other scholars too, but you too, you can see how obviously, you know, they were you guys were the ones that were really in my mind, is that now when you look at an event like the Sea of Galilee episode where Jesus says, well, you're going to, you know, follow me and you'll be catching men, you can try to look at it, well, what does this mean in terms of a secret brotherhood?
Initiation.
Right? Exactly. Why are these events of Jesus, who is clearly, in my mind, a fictional character, why are the authors picking these particular events? And so it leads the understanding of the fictional nature of Jesus through the components of his life, which are clearly related to all of these prior religions, that process just flows right in through to the picking of the details of his ministry. And they simply created a little secret brotherhood, which essentially is the imperial cult brotherhood. But their thought world is coming right out of those secret brotherhoods.
There you go.
And they are now just creating their literature, their little secret brotherhood literature, which is just the new era, the kingdom come that Jesus had predicted, where they have replaced other secret brotherhoods.
And we're finding, you know, it's interesting because this particular group that we're talking about, the Flavians, and that era, who had such fabulous power and wealth and connections and the ability to influence reality in any way they wanted to, that they were, in turn, highly influenced by the Egyptian religion. That's clear. I mean, Josephus makes a point of talking about how they were at the Temple of Isis the night before the destruction of the Jerusalem temple. And then we also know from Josephus, or from Suetonius and Tacitus, that Vespasian had gone to Mount Carmel, which is a whole other story that we can get into. It's fascinating. But that he goes to Egypt, and he goes into the temple of Serapis. So Serapis, which was a Greco-Egyptian Jewish hybrid god, and that was really, those were the three main cultures, well, the Romans obviously as well, but the three main cultures in Alexandria at the time.
Would you mind just going through that god and show his transition from the pagan origin through how Vespasian, you know, interacted with his miracle, and then how that pops up in the gospel? Because I just was, when you described that, I just thought that was really
well, you know, you had Ptolemy commission the creation of this god, which is, you know, kind of interesting because it's also doing the Septuagint too, right? So, or one of the Ptolemies. So, Serapis is a Greco-Egyptian hybrid. It's actually Osiris and Apis. And he was deliberately created by the priests in order to unify constantly warring factions within Alexandria, which would be the Greeks and the Jews. But overtly it was the Greeks and the Egyptians that this god was supposed to be appealing to. But then we find out later on, with the story of Hadrian, the letter to Hadrian or from Hadrian, that the Jews are also worshiping Serapis. And I think that was the intention of this creation, was to unify those three major factions. And so you find this god, one of the things that the Greeks and the Jews had in common was animal sacrifice. They were not willing to give it up. And so Serapis becomes this unique god to whom they can do animal sacrifice. And so there's this attempt at unifying them. And it doesn't apparently succeed, obviously. In retrospect, we look at it, it doesn't succeed. But it goes on for, until the middle of the 2nd century. And it's interesting that we find Vespasian at the end of the 1st century, or the last quarter of the 1st century, going into the temple of Serapis. And, you can see that gives... Serapis is like the biggest thing around, obviously, if that's the case. He comes out with a miraculous capacity to heal, supposedly. And interestingly enough, Serapis, here we have the Egyptian god, and Osiris is part of Serapis, and Osiris' son Horus is also interchangeable with Osiris. It's very complicated, but it's understandable that because they're not real people. So you have one merging into the other and so forth. And so Horus at that time was known as a healer. There are actual artifacts of statues where Horus is being invoked as a healer. Serapis is a healer. Horus is a healer. Horus, one of Horus's miraculous healing techniques apparently was having to do with spit. And, I wouldn't be surprised if Serapis was also known for having spit. They were pretty much the same character. Yeah. And so Vespasian emerges from this with the ability to heal the blind with spit. And then we hear the same story in the New Testament, which by all evidence was not in existence at all. Even, conservative scholars, biblical scholars, will claim that the New Testament wasn't in existence when Vespasian was doing this miracle.
Right.
So there's those parallels there that are really important.
Yeah, because they really show sort of the thought world that the stories that end up in the gospel came from. And they come right out of the Egyptian religion. This ends up in the imperial cult, where the Roman Caesars who are deified try to take on the attributes of the gods that they know about, the Egyptian myth gods.
Yeah, they already had this history.
And then this process continues right on through into the gospel.
Exactly. If the Caesars have been deified, a few of them anyway, and if they are in other depictions in other eras, having some kind of divine qualities added to their biographies, and also making a play for power in this direction of trying to be deified, then it makes perfect sense that they would try to present themselves as the Jewish Messiah as well. And in fact, we know that Vespasian was recognized as the Jewish Messiah in his day.
Yeah, that's the thing, is that all of the Flavian court historians, Josephus, Dio, Tacitus, and Suetonius, they simply recorded that the messianic prophecies the Jews had foresaw the Flavian Caesars, the dynasty of Vespasian.
That's in Josephus.
It's right in Josephus, and I just the way I look at that is that that's Christianity, because it is it's a kind of Christ, and in fact, it's a little more coherent to think of as the basis of the Roman Christianity, because you have the Father, the Son, and the Hagia Noumena, the awful spirit, which is Domitian. So the Flavian Christianity then is, in my opinion, the basis for what are referred to as the Christian Flavians, this collection of saints that Roman Christianity recognizes as among the earliest saints, in fact, the earliest saints following the characters in the Gospels.
I think it beautifully dovetails all of this.
Yeah.
It really does, because
Yeah.
we have the Gnostic endeavors going on in
Yeah.
Syria. We have the Therapeutes in Egypt doing
Yeah.
their thing. Yeah, so I think what you're bringing to the table dovetails beautifully with what's going on in the rest of the Mediterranean at the time. And there's unquestionably an effort to synthesize Christianity, or rather Judaism and pagan religions. There's an effort to focus on at least one divine person on earth, and that would be Caesar in the most overt way. But behind the scenes, when we see this brotherhood aspect going on too, and it's multifactional. It's not like one solid brotherhood, everybody's of one mind and so forth. There's all kinds of factions there, and they're competing. And so you start seeing, what you're seeing now is you're bringing in, like, say, in the earlier part of the 1st century, you could find there's certainly some Gnosticizing, some Syrian Gnosticizing effort going on. There's this intertestamental literature where they're talking about the two messiahs, one being spiritual and one being a temporal warrior. There's in Alexandria, there's clearly something going on with this group called the Therapeutes, and they're no slouches, because they're being favored by Philo, who is tied into the Flavians. In fact, he's a major player in the...
Yeah, I mean, the Therapeutes could have been one of the basis of what this group saw as the ideal religious structure.
The monkishness, quite clearly, it was so blatantly obvious to Christians of the 2nd, 3rd century, or 3rd, 4th century with Eusebius, that he said the Therapeutes were the early Christians.
Yeah.
And so, you have to focus on that, and you think about, okay, so what's going on there? You've got Philo writing about them. You've got Philo putting out this literature that is also so clearly used in Christianity.
He uses the expression logos in essentially the same way that the Gospels...
Yeah, he's describing Jesus to a T. In other words, looking at it retrospectively, in describing Jesus as the logos, they're using Philo. There's no question about that. And then, but Philo happens to be the uncle of Tiberius Alexander in Alexandria, and he's one of this Flavian group that we're focusing on.
Yeah, and Philo and the Alexanders would have had the understanding of Scripture needed to actually have produced the Gospels. Someone needed to know, and they also had...
Philo unquestionably was studying the Scriptures.
Yes, but Philo was very Hellenized, and so he had the understanding of the Egyptian and other
Greek
levels of in Greek mythologies. So it's in that...
In fact, he disdains it.
Yeah.
He makes disparaging remarks about Egyptian gods. And so, already turning up the nose, but at the same time embracing, because the Therapeutes apparently were Isis worshippers as well. But Philo is working in Alexandria, and he's heavily... comparatively speaking, he's very Jewish, very involved in keeping up the Jewish heritage. But Tiberius Alexander, far less so. In fact, the question was whether he had abandoned Judaism. And he inherits Philo's brothers, his father, his wealth.
Yep.
And so, again, not sitting around twiddling his thumbs with this wealth, I have no doubt that that's one of the reasons why Philo's work was so widespread, and in his lifetime even, it seems, and certainly well preserved, because they had the money.
The money was able to get the publications out that it wanted. And Tiberius Alexander was really interesting in that he was supposed to be the first person to stand for Vespasian as Caesar.
Yeah, this is really...
And in the document,
germane.
And the document. Did you know that the document still exists? that Alexander wrote, or at least a copy of it does. And in the document, he refers to Vespasian as Lord. And this is fascinating to me, because this was exactly what the Messianic Jews that the Flavians were fighting against in Judea wouldn't do. Josephus recorded that they tortured this group with fire and everything they could think of, even the children, and they would refuse to call Caesar Lord. But Tiberius, the Alexanders, they had no trouble with that.
Because they were also cozy, and this
They're
was
making
a
so much
mutual
money. Yeah,
benefit
there it is, right.
to all of them.
Yeah, so there's all of the intellectual structures all together at the same time.
And it shows all of that effort that they made. It shows that that was a goal, was to get to have this Caesar recognized as a divinity on earth, as had predecessors been. Basically that was one of the problems. The religions of the Roman Empire were allowed to exist so long as they paid tribute to the Caesar as either the leader or the divine on earth, and so but the most devout Jewish factions would not do that, of course, and so we know that this is a big problem, and you could see the dynamics of why Christianity had to be created then. It wasn't like some divine revelation. It was purely contrived by the political forces who were extremely wealthy for the specific purpose of rolling all these religions into one. But that, that problematic Judaism was the biggest factor there. They would have been probably content to go on and on and on with multiple cults of wide variety, from Mithraism to the cult of Cybele and Attis, and all the Egyptian religion and the Greek and so forth. They would have been probably perfectly happy to have that. But it wasn't just live and let live. These devout or fanatic Jews were making life miserable. And they were a threat to the empire because they didn't simply rebel, but they set up a nation state right inside the empire with their own government, and they got to the point where they're actually minting their own coins. Yes.
And you see, as I see it, that is just impossible to accept if you're a Caesar, because this would, of course, lead to other rebellions everywhere else. And of course, Josephus recorded that one of the big problems with the Jews was that they were everywhere. They were in all parts of the empire. And so had they set up a nation state successfully in Judea, then it would have been a threat to the entire empire, because it could happen in other places. So.
Yeah, and it seems like almost counterproductive then to create a new diaspora, but
right.
But they were already there. I mean, Alexandria was, Philo recorded that Alexandria was 50% Jewish at the time, and there was something like 500,000 people.
Yeah, and there was a big rebellion, and Tiberius Alexander was lauded by Josephus for stepping in strongly to put the rebellion of Jews down, and he killed 50,000.
This is not something that people forget.
Right. Yeah.
This is like, we look back and we have almost cartoonish impression of the era, and these little details that must have been really striking at the time.
Yeah.
To us they're just like, well, that's just a little blip here and a little blip there, but these are like sores that are needing attention. Now we look back at them and the body is dead, so who cares about the sores? But at the time, these were really
and those sores
annoying.
Were energy for the movement, the Messianic movement that was in existence in Judea. The militaristic version must have taken energy from all those episodes. And in fact, in one of the scrolls, they talk about a slaughter that the Romans had perpetrated on Jews, and that they were commiserating the date of the Roman slaughter. And so you can see that these episodes must have been open wounds in their heart, and that there was energy coming all the time from this conflict with Rome. And these are
not people who forget easily.
They don't forget. No, they don't forget. And so the Roman solution was brutal but effective.
Well, it certainly changed a whole slew of what we would call Jews into Christians. I mean,
evidently,
we have really basically the Pharisees surviving. The Samaritans and the Sadducees disappear, and I know where they disappeared into. They became Christians essentially. Yeah. But people don't talk about that. That's another one of those strange mysteries that, if you look too closely, you'll find the uncomfortable truth. So there was this focus on a Messiah coming to the Jews, and and that was really the only group that's like waiting for someone to come rescue them, so to speak. So there wasn't really even that much of a motivation for a the Greeks, for example, to create a new god. There wasn't much motivation for the Romans to create a new god other than what we're talking about. If it hadn't been for the Jews, Jesus Christ would not have been created.
And I think that the Egyptians had essentially gone through the process. The Ptolemies had become raw.
They're the pharaohs,
right?
And the pharaoh is God on earth.
But in Judea, that's where the religious struggle was the basis of the movement against the empire. And so you had to come up with a new god at that point. Yeah.
And we had to have this god be anchored into history at some point.
Yeah, somehow,
the Gnostic efforts were obviously synthesizing. They were trying to, they had so many different cultures they're bringing together. And all of the cultures of the Roman Empire,
sure.
basically, although
yeah.
I'm not too sure about how much of the British. We have another kind of dynamic
I wish
going
we knew
on
more
from
about
there.
their religion.
Well, we have this character named Jesus, who was a woodworker.
Yeah.
Jesus the woodworker,
right.
Jesus the carpenter.
Yeah.
It's like, hey. And so these little blips we can find possibly of trying to incorporate that part of the Roman Empire into it, but we have this Gnostic effort going on where they're dealing with the Syrians and the Jews, and even Indian stuff is making its way in there, and yet it's so otherworldly. Mm-hmm. It's like tried to make it too distant. Maybe they're thinking, hey, nobody will fight over this if it's up there, out there somewhere. But it couldn't reach the masses. It's almost, even today, to people who study it, is incomprehensible, mm-hmm. the Gnostic efforts. So that was like Then things like Mithraism, there's not enough female energy in that one. They excised the Anahita, the goddess. And so that didn't appeal to women. And not having, anchoring the God on earth, actually, in a funny way, Judaism allowed them to anchor the God on earth. It's odd because of this messianic concept.
Yeah.
I mean, the Greeks weren't waiting for another Hercules, the son of God, to come. They did believe that Hercules had been a real person. But none of them were waiting for a divinely, other than the Caesar, who's already there.
It's so clear in the scrolls,
appointed.
isn't it, that they're waiting for someone. They want
to
someone,
free them from Rome.
Someone and they look in their scriptures, and that's why, to me, the Peshers are the most important scriptures, because they're looking back for patterns, literary patterns that they can then extend out into the present time and in the future. In fact, they're linking patterns from Habakkuk, for example, to the righteous teacher's life, and they're sort of seeing that if this pattern existed there and then this would occur at this point. And so, since they are looking into their past scriptures in this way, then when they look to David, for example, they would see an anointed Messiah who, when he has military battle, he brings the power of God with him. And if little David can take on Goliath with no problem, then that's a metaphor that they can use in the present time, and they can go, gee, if we could just get a real Christ here somehow who had that connection,
it fits
we
in so
could
perfectly,
go
it's
in and kick these guys out.
It fits in so perfectly that the Judaizing and historicizing effort really kicks into gear after the scriptures are are finally stolen, if you will, from the temple. I mean, like I say, there were all these other previous efforts, and the scriptures that Eusebius names, the Therapeutes, as being the basis of the Gospels. Which Gospels? He's talking the canonical Gospels at that point, but. What state they were in. They're allegorizing. They weren't necessarily in Judea. They'd probably be missing. They would be missing all of the ministry, so to speak, because it's based on Titus's campaign. So we would have something like this allegorized or symbolic Messiah going on there, and then. The Gnostics obviously had their hands on Jewish literature, but there's that whole intertestamental stuff. There's plenty to draw from, and then the Greek and Roman gods and Indian texts that come in later in this. They're all missing, this one key piece that doesn't come into play until after the temple is destroyed.
Right, So you can see how it's all structured. And the point you made I thought was really interesting. It's after you have there's no expansion of the Jewish scripture up until the Flavians take control of it. In other words, it's very hermetically sealed inside their culture. You don't see you don't see Christ literature popping up. The Josephus records that they took all of the artifacts in the temple back and they put them in public display, but then the scripture they kept inside the palace. Well, this is amazing because your point is that this is exactly when suddenly you had an explosion of different forms of Jewish literature and different intersections with Jewish literature and other religions. Well, it had never happened before, but suddenly after it gets into the scripture gets into the Flavian court, at that exact moment, then as you go forward through the second century, you start having different ideas and different ways of evaluating Jewish scripture. I think it's because it got into the Flavian court that this happened. But that means that you can essentially trace a lot of the literature to that point.
We should be able to look a little more closely. It's really a mushy time period, obviously.
Yeah.
I mean, we're looking back, but we should be able to look at some of the players who could have gotten their hands on the Tanakh at that point. The Old Testament, as they call it, the Jewish scriptures.
Yeah.
And in fact, we do have right after that the Council of Yavne. Then they.
Right, and it's very fascinating because
the Old Testament becomes canonized.
Yavnev, then you start having the stories which end up in the Talmud, and the oldest stories, the Mishnah and the Targum, have authors who claim to be converts from the Flavian family. Oncleos actually has in the preface of the Targum an acknowledgement to Uncle Titus, thanking him for being able to convert to Judaism.
Uncle Titus is the emperor?
Our Titus Flavius. And so then this...
He converts him to Judaism.
He thanked him for permission to be able to. But then Oncleos...
So now we've got a Roman state Judaism that is sanctioned.
Sanctioned and
the rebels are dispersed, and you can join if you're. And then
So Yavnev is a Herodian grounds, which is given by a Flavian land grant to Zakkai. Zakkai had got it because he had, according to the Talmud, he had ascribed the messianic prophecies to, amazingly, Vespasian.
Wow.
and so now you have
this
the Roman Judaism is being formed at Yavnev. You have the different players are all coming in, and
they're patronizing it now.
There it is. You got it. And so that's how I see it. And then you have
it's a small step from there to Christianity.
Then it's a small step, yeah. And the really interesting thing is in the Acts of Neros and Achilles, they then record that Clement, who is given the mantle of the papacy from Simon,
becomes pope.
Is
Clement I.
Is the another nephew of Titus.
Right. Yeah. That is. You'd think that things would be more closely looked at in that.
Well, it is odd.
We think that God is supposed to be doing all this, right?
Well,
Jesus comes as God
Well, it's
on
like
earth,
in your book, you say follow the money. Well, if you just follow it, you go, okay. Well, here are the families, here are the players, here's Yavnev, here are the authors, here's the first pope. Wow. It isn't that confusing a picture. The church hides it, but they can't hide the syncretic nature of Jesus. Good research scholars will really burrow in and get it.
I have ministers telling me they're taught at seminary that Christianity is syncretic.
Is your book now like a textbook?
Well, some certainly there are.
It should be
people reading it who want a deeper look into at least one of my books, Christ in Egypt, for example, is like heavy duty. But so this is interesting. So we're looking at a pope. We're looking at Pope Clement. And now he one would suspect that he has the ability to access whatever scriptures they are now,
Presumably,
they're now working on,
Yeah.
actively working on to create the state Jewish religion,
Yeah.
right? The Roman state. That's fascinating. So then, what we really want to find out is precisely what condition the Christos religion is at that point.
It's interesting. Well, it's an interesting is Pope Clement's letter is maybe gives us some clues. What I find fascinating about it is that he's got some problem with some community, and he's writing a letter to them to straighten up. And he gives an example of how he wants them to be organized and to function as the Roman army. And he has this long description of how he wants the bishops to be here and the priests to be here and the congregation. And he keeps going back to how the centurions work with this and that. And it's just, you look at this and
so
you go...
So the Christos is then has to be Titus.
Well, it just...
Vespasian.
Well, I would say the Christos has to be the Pontiff Maximus.
Who is
that's another word
Caesar.
for Caesar, right? So I just... once I started, my path, as I got sort of my head around, well, it's a myth, and it's a myth from a secret brotherhood.
Yeah.
Frankly, that was the only way I could make any sense out of it. Once I had that as my premise, that was the only way I could actually read the thing and make any sense.
It does make sense if that papal lineage has any merit whatsoever. But then we look at the attributes that were the so-called Jewish attributes that are given to Jesus, his locations and location.
Yeah.
And then we see that it points to that group again, and then you have these Flavian Christians.
Yeah, but it's just fascinating because you also have the Herods who are inbreeding with the Maccabees. They're trying to become the royal lineage, and they're taking Maccabean wives. They are...
The Maccabees are usurped in
they,
this effort.
And of course that's Lazarus, Judas, John, Matthew, Mark. You have the Maccabean family names popping up in the story that's being created about this individual.
And they're being made to be subordinate to the new Christos.
Exactly. And you see, that would have been a...
Christos has kind of two faces even in the New Testament.
Yeah.
That he's supposed to be the Son of God and the Son of Man, and yet he's talking about a Son of Man as if the Son of Man is someone else.
Exactly. He has that third person thing he does all the time where he's talking about... and when he's going to show up, before the generation is alive passes away, but this should be me. But in the secret brotherhood language, it could also be someone else, too. So, it's just... I think that the historical dots are fairly... well established. Once you have the right perspective, you can kind of make some sense out of how all this history works. But then if you want to go from there to where the Constantine actually, codifies the gospel, I think as I've told people, the best place to look is your work, because then you can actually see the different forces that are morphing with the story as you're moving the religion forward.
Well, this adds to... There's two serious strains.
Yeah.
There's subdivisions in them, but one is the salvation cultists would be following a Jesus figure, Joshua, Yeshua, and so forth. And then we have this Christos over here. But, it gets really complicated. But I see that again, taking it back to say that, okay, we've got Joshua cultists who are expecting a Messiah. We've got Romans who insist that they are already the God on earth.
Yeah, right. It's just...
And, combining them, we have Jesus Christ, Jesus, Joshua, salvation, Christos, Messiah. You can see that it's like really mechanical.
Yeah,
it's not organic. Like it just is spontaneously erupted.
And it's mechanical because it's your premise of follow the money. Now, when you follow the money, it's almost always mechanical because mechanics means power, and power has to have money, and so this is the motive. The Christianity really, let's face it, is just it's a government project that has to do with wealth creation and wealth protection. We have 401ks. they developed
That absolutely makes sense.
they developed Christianity, and it was just and these
state
families must
religion.
have had this problem because they have all the money. The Alexanders, the Herods, and the Flavians, they had all the money, so they had to work out some way to keep from these wars.
You know, I
that
think
keep
it's
popping up,
amusing.
you know, yeah.
There's a whole bunch of skeptics who think that there was some guy there underneath
Yeah.
the story, right?
Yeah.
Who was running around Judea
Yeah.
and who got himself, who ran afoul of the Roman emperors, or
Yeah.
the authorities, and so somehow that was morphed into this supernatural tale. And okay, so we have the Christians who believe that this happened for real.
Yeah.
And the only way that it could have happened, by the way, how they describe it, would have been through some supernatural divine intervention, right? And then you have the skeptics who claim that underneath the fairy tales is a person. But then I find that to be even more, almost, if certainly as supernatural as the first one, because how is that guy going to be adopted by these filthy, rich, powerful people? Are they going to say, "Oh yeah, there was some guy
Right, yeah.
there, and you've convinced me
that
he had
exactly."
that-"
It's like the family of
It's
Caesar.
ridiculous.
You'd have some wandering mystic in
It
Judea.
would be ridiculous.
And
They
go,
would never have
okay,
done that.
This is what we're going to get into
Yeah.
right now.
Yeah,
Is that
we're-
this is the religion we think makes a lot of
Yeah,
sense.
the Roman Senate
And-
is going to
right.
like drop all of
Exactly.
its
It's like
gods
a religion
and
that practices
it's
poverty
ridiculous.
and humility would not be very
Right.
attractive to a family or group of families that practice neither. You know, they didn't humility, poverty. These are not attributes that they'd be interested in.
And in fact,
today.
it's
silly.
It's contradicted in the Gospels themselves
Yeah.
when you have Caesar, render under Caesar, and the establishment of authority. That
Yeah.
authority comes from God, therefore obey authority. And it says right in the Pauline epistles, honor the emperor.
Yeah.
Well,
Exactly.
how do you ignore that as being just a blatant propaganda?
Yeah, and because it's so repetitive, because that theme of obedience and Caesar being, it just occurs so often.
Jesus doesn't come to free the slaves. He tells them to obey, or
Exactly.
through Paul, whatever. We're told that it's best to be an obedient slave.
Exactly.
Not to rebel
Yeah.
and not to be freed.
Yeah, I mean, and
The last thing they would do was follow some hippie dude. Okay,
Right.
even if he did have supernatural powers.
right, and you know that the Messianic movement of Judea wouldn't have been attracted to this character either, because they rebel.
Oh yeah, turn the other cheek, render unto Caesar
he would
what
have
Caesar's.
the
Right,
character
yeah.
in the Gospels
Oh, yeah.
has no connection with this group. He would have no connection with the Roman families. It's obviously just a government operation to try to make a little money. I mean,
But to keep the peace, to keep the power, to keep the
calm down,
status quo.
Yeah,
You know.
and then I think they when they go through the process that you write about, and so then they go, well, now it's a state religion. We'll try to use the same kind of control devices. We'll just set up the bloody feudal system. And then we have the Pope at top, the Pontiff Maximus, the general is next, or emperor's next, and you just work your way all the way down. And they don't even need an army to keep the rebels pacified because they have God's emissary right on earth. It just was an ingenious conception.
Yeah, it was
absolutely incredible.
kind of a
how
smooth
clever. So
transition,
smooth. Yeah, and then of course technology has to go out the window, and the natural connections between religion and people have to go out the window, because then the people would be too wise to be serfs, you see.
They're getting it from almost, I mean, even though the astrotheological, it's in the sky and so forth, but it's almost like from the ground up, and in this case we're talking the power coming from the top down, and you're there in the natural religions. You're connected to the earth. You're free. You don't have this domineering monotheistic character controlling you like a puppet master. It's not there.
Yeah, and that's that's one of the reasons I was really delighted that you wanted to be in this documentary, because it isn't enough to just show that Christianity has an origin that was false. To really express the thought that I have, you need to also bring into play what is
The meaning.
where are we headed from here. And that's why when I was listening to you talk about the journey that we can take into the, and paraphrased, into the power that real religion, religion that's based in the power of the planets and of the
Observation
earth.
of the natural world.
I see this really having a way of creating a new energy in people that is positive. That a lot of the problems that we're facing are in fact related to the wrong religion that is producing bad ideas, and so that's why I just the transition between the stuff that the way that you were able to form. Or the way you're able to deconstruct Jesus, like you were saying, it's an onion. You start peeling him down, there's nothing left. It's just fiction. Well, now even the details of his life just disappear. There is nothing left. But then what you have left of it is the original.
Titus.
Yeah, is the religion. Yeah, no one is going to like as a god when they get to see this guy. But what we hope they'll have is a real onion. Something that actually does have layers and has dimension. It doesn't just disappear upon analysis. So. Let's just hope,
what is the meaning? The meaning of it behind it is that it's very empowering. It's earth based.
Yeah.
You got your feet planted instead of being a puppet like jerked around like this.
Yeah.
You're drawing wisdom into yourself from your own observations.
That's right, exactly.
And they had to sever that in order to get this top down, this top heavy.
I hope even if we can't use like things, I hope that we can at least use the last 30 seconds of the speech you gave, because I just thought that was really moving, and it's not just moving, but I just think it's just really a profound truth, one that just can't be repeated enough.
Yeah. Well, we'll figure that out. Let's go right there.
Yeah,
so,
I just love that stuff, Yeah.
We find out that, of course, the meaning behind the mythical aspects of Christianity has largely to do with the ancient earth-based religions or nature-worshipping. I consider Earth a planet, so planet is part of astrotheology and so forth, so everything is astrotheology in that regard. But that if this strange psychic trauma that is called Christianity had not been foisted upon millions of people, we quite likely would not be facing this almost apocalyptic development of destruction of the planet.
Yeah.
I mean, for one example, before the technological age, a major example was that in certain parts in the so-called pagan world, or the astrotheologically based cultures, nature worship, it was a capital punishment to cut down forests.
Right.
But with this disconnect out of the desert, where there were no forests, and who cares about the trees? We survive, in different ways. It's just like ravaging our natural world.
There's no concept of the future. There's just what you can take right now, because that's all that desert people, that's how they have to live. They have to live with, if it's available, they have to take it right now because it's
survival, it's predatory, it's lacking in empathy.
Yep.
It's cruel, tyrannical, barbarous, violent.
It's Christianity.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it is.
And I mean, I'm not saying that about Christians individually, but that is the truth about the religion.
Well, it's a truth about the aspects of it that were highly focused on by the power mongers. Who wanted this top-down.
Sure.
I mean, so, of course, certainly, there's certain aspects of Christianity that were. There's definitely an improvement in the case of they're trying to end human sacrifice. But of course, in order to do that, to impose Christianity on us all, they had to sacrifice millions of humans. So that didn't work out very well.
Well, I think that the reason that Judaism was the core religion that they wanted to morph into a state religion was because it was a desert religion. And if you look at the relationship of power between the individual and Yahweh, it's pretty much what they wanted, the Caesars wanted to have between themselves
That's that
and
monotheism,
their subjects.
tyrannical
and so,
monotheism.
Yeah, exactly. And then, whereas, as I understand, most of the, particularly the European religions, that just wasn't the case, like you were talking about.
Local deities. I mean, we could go out and talk to the sprites in that bush over there. And that was not only perfectly allowed, but it was expected. For you to become empowered,
you wouldn't cut down a forest, for example.
You wouldn't cut down the forest.
There would be energy in the tree. You'd see some sort of meaning and energy in the trees. You know.
They had these cultures had use for them. The trees were a continuation of life.
Right.
But again, with the desert regions, it's almost like a kind of spite. You can't. We don't have the trees. You can't have the trees.
Yeah, cut them down.
I mean, the things that have been done needlessly by people who seem to be... There's an interesting movie called The Pathfinder. It's a story, it's actually a legend, I think it's about a 1,000-year-old legend in Finland, where and it so perfectly exemplifies what you see in the Old Testament. It's in a different culture, though. It's really interesting. In fact, I think they're called like the Chudes,
really?
Which is really strange.
Wow.
This group of men dressed in black going around and slaughtering villagers. This is in Finland, and killing them all and taking their belongings. And the Pathfinder says they have lost the way in their heart. Mm-hmm. And it looks like Old Testament religion to me. I mean,
right.
It's a group of very violent men who have no conscience about murdering other human beings.
We could just go out on the tragedy of the tradition that Christians have been exposed to, because they're exposed to the Old Testament through the version of it that they received in the Gospels. But all of those murderous events where God is sanctioning the Israelite slaughtering of other ethnicities, that then becomes the basis of the religion that is then foisted on the Europeans.
Supremacist.
And it just was a catastrophe, just an absolute cultural catastrophe for Europeans.
Absolutely. This is one of the reasons that I am motivated, is because I looked at the destruction that occurred to my culture.
Yeah.
I'm Northern European. And it was so defamatory and so vile that it put the fire in my belly. Not only did they have to suffer the indignation of this alien cult coming in and usurping them and severing them from their natural surroundings where they could talk to the sprite in the bush that was so local. Yeah. You have this alien foreign thing invading. Not only did they do that, but they weren't content with just, spiritually severing them. They do go in and destroy their temples and then move monks onto the site to live on the site. And they would, desecrate this temple. They would actually use them as toilets. Then, oddly enough, they'd build a church over the toilet. I mean, what is the symbolism there? I mean, so it was just complete and total humiliation, as if they were the most evil, vile things that had ever existed.
Exactly.
And we had to,
even down to the extent where the names that people had, which had such direct connection to their culture and to their environment, were changed to biblical names, where they end up with, Joseph, Mary, David. All of these names are popping up and replacing the names that had originated right out of the culture, right? And that's why I'm hoping that as more people understand the fact that those names were brought into the culture in the way that they were, that people stop abandoning those names, because we really want to. I think it's just the names are good reminders of where you should be looking for energy and spirit. Rather than,
well, that's one of the reasons why I use the name Sanning, because it's Swedish for truth. And I recognize that it's. I mean, even down to the names that we've been ripped away from.
Our culture has been eviscerated.
Yeah, really has been.
Yeah.
And now, in bringing us back to this point of esteeming our natural world, of connecting with, even now, we're not obviously living in Northern Europe, so we can't reconnect to our original ancestral heritage, which to me isn't even that big of a deal because I'm a child of the universe. I'm not that hung up on my genetic heritage. It's just the vessel that I occupy. But
1 minute.
okay, but we're not, saying that we need to take all of this seriously as if it has to become a new religion that we have to, it can be enjoyed, it can be appreciated. It's not something that we have this conditioning. You're going to go to hell if we don't follow something. But no, you can enjoy it, you can appreciate it. If you don't do it, terrible things aren't going to happen to you. You're not going to be punished with eternal hellfire or any of that. But
I think our work simply will bring peace and wisdom.
all right.